Today on the Whole Person podcast, I get to interview one of my friends and who's honestly become somewhat of a mentor of mine in health and wellness, Dr. Mark Sherwood, who has been on our podcast before. He runs functional medicine with his wife, as well as he's a retired police officer and former SWAT team member, if I remember that correctly. And so welcome back to the show, Dr. Mark Sherwood. How are you?
Evan, I'm doing great. I appreciate you having me. I've been looking forward to coming back on with you, so I'm excited.
Good. Well, today I want to talk about mental health and how supplements, herbs, and our physical stature, as well as what we put in our mouth, affect it. And as you know, I've been on this journey myself of losing weight, eating better, taking vitamins to have more clarity and to be less anxious in my life and to show up better and to be a better husband and a better father. And, you know, the other day, you and I were talking about vitamins, and I sent a vitamin to you like, hey, what do you think about this vitamin? And you're like, yeah, no, that's crap. And the context of it was that, you know, it had 5 different types of vitamins in one, and the whole vitamin was like 300 milligrams, which wasn't hardly anything of anything. And you're like, no, if you need ashwagandha, if you need rhodiola, if you need, just take that because it's going to come in a higher dosage. And so it got me thinking about how vitamins affect our life because the lack of nutrients in our food. And so I wanted to open this up with you and say, what are some important nutrients that we are missing from our food that help our mental health as well as showing up better for our family?
Well, I'll answer it with 2 prongs of the same answer, but they're 2 different directions. And it's important when you ask a question and people start getting into this issue, which is very challenging from many aspects and very confusing as well. You have to look, I call, to each side of the coin plus the third side of the coin. Number one is this. With the idea of mental health and diagnoses today regarding mental health, such as ADHD, ADD, OCD, etc., it's becoming nothing more than a dumping box of excuse-making labels. If you go back and look at Jesus' day, he did not deal with mental health. He dealt with demon oppression and demon possession. So let's think about this from this aspect. Anxiety and mental health most of the time is really definitely inclusive of the demon possession or oppression. Now, that's one side of the coin. Another side of the coin is this, is that people, as a general rule, are not born with mental illnesses, but they get created over the course of time because of, in part, nutrient deficiencies. There are 2 key neurotransmitters that people should understand. One is called serotonin and one is called dopamine. Serotonin is primarily produced in the gut of all places, a place we sometimes call the second brain. Dopamine, we know, is produced in the neurotransmitters, the neural synapse of the mind. These are known as excitatory neurotransmitters. In other words, they keep you motivated, engaged, content, attentive, right? When a person is low dopamine, they are said to be ADD, ADHD, maybe even autistic to a point. Low serotonin, everybody would get this, is depression, blue mood, sadness, not content no matter what happens. The formation of dopamine and serotonin is only done if there is good gut health, as I talked about earlier, with that neurotransmitter serotonin primarily being formed in the gut, and get this, B vitamins and magnesium in a process within the body called methylation. And that was a big answer to a short question, but the bottom line is all of those things factor in to ensuring the body is chemically producing this right combination so that we won't feel the burden of life inappropriately.
Yeah. You know, I've been reading a book very slowly called, oh my gosh. And now as soon as I bring it up, I forgot the title. It's called Eat to Beat Depression and Anxiety.
Yeah.
And it's where I learned a lot about how gut health affects the brain, and that the gut is the second brain. And so obviously, in my opinion, our food is so processed and there's so many chemicals that it robs the nutrients out of the soil, which doesn't produce the nutrients in the food, which then ultimately goes to our gut. And so I think in large, there's multiple issues. One, our health and the way we eat here sucks. And how do we go through this process of like, all right, I need to learn about this process. I need to learn what my body needs. Meanwhile, I have addictions and behaviors and habits that need to be broken. And on top of, I need to start supplementing right away so that I can start seeing a more immediate change in my mental clarity and stress, anxiety. I tell you what, like yesterday, I actually took some GABA, and I recently just got it. And holy cow, in one setting, I could tell the difference, because I went through some major stress scene yesterday, but I noticed my heart rate didn't fluctuate. I still had a low heart rate. I felt good. I felt stressed, but I didn't feel the cortisol rushing through my body because I felt like it was balanced. And so how do we go about learning how to eat appropriately for our gut health and what that looks like, and then simultaneously learning what supplementation looks like?
When we look at food as a general rule, we don't need to look at our government. We don't need to look at medicine, and we don't need to look at church. We must understand that today's food supplies, especially what we're seeing in school food, is the idea of a bunch of anti-nutrient, non-nutrient frankenfoods, as I like to call them, that are high in processed sugars and refined grain products and dairy products. Now, having said that, as we talked earlier about the idea of neurotransmitters needed to prevent depression, anxiety, etc., let's examine what those sugars and refined grain and dairy products do. The sugars actually hit on what's called the dopaminergic pathways, which is the same pathway, coincidentally, that cocaine hits off of. Studies were done many times with rats, and it looked like this. The rats were in a cage. There were two different bins of food from which they could select. And the investigators, or the study design persons here, filled both bins with sugars within their food. And then they decided to put one bin full of more sugar and one bin full of more cocaine. It took not but a few minutes for all the rats, in repeated studies, I might add, to gravitate toward the sugar. So sugar became more addicting than cocaine. Hence, the idea that food addiction is real, again, with refined sugars driving the dopamine pathways. Now, with the refined grains and refined dairy proteins, it gets a little bit more quirky and odd. When those things get processed in the gut, they actually create something called exorphins, EXORPHINS. Kind of sounds like morphine, doesn't it? Well, it actually acts like that because those hit on the opioid receptors and they generate sort of a pain relief or a calm. But again, neither of them provide any sort of nutritional value, which is very tragic. So there's an addiction created there, almost like cocaine and opioids within people today. And when you look at them, you say you need to make some changes. They look at you like you're from Mars.
Kind of looking at a new gate.
Oh, they're like, no way, I can't do it. So we have addiction that's created and perpetrated and even subsidized into our society. It is permissive and even implored as healthy from the government and from even medicine. It's permissive within the mainstream institutionalized church, and nobody wants to deal with it. But the whole time we're seeing people get more and more depressed, aren't we? Again, in today's world, where do people go when they can't find a friend? Well, they go to that bag of chips because that's their friend. They can control that. That bag of chips will never talk back to them. It will always do what they say. It will obey them and it will love them like an eternal companion. Problem is, it drives them towards eternity a lot faster. It's an addiction process, Evan, that we've got to get past. And then when you look at where to go, you have to think about things under this caveat or this context is like, if something, you can imagine it in its packaging, the way it was created, being growing on a tree, from the ground, from a bush, below the ground, walking on the ground, or swimming in a creek, it probably is food. But if it's not like that, not only is it not food, but it was never food. In other words, there was no, and this is not an indictment upon anything or anybody, there was no Big Mac trees in the Garden of Eden. There was no Cheeto bushes. There was no donut shrubs. They weren't there. And so today, it's interesting how we've used this as masquerading as food, and we've watched health trends of our society get worse and worse and worse. Right now, 1 in 4 Americans are on antidepressants. 1 in 4. I mean, What is that? Are we born that way? No, we're not. We acquire that over time because of all these deficiencies created. And then we deal with it in the wrong way. And so even the conversation we're having today is a very challenging one, because there's people out there that are labeled, I have, or I am. I was told I was ADHD. Stop. I'm not even sure what that is, other than you've never been told the truth. So we get these labels and self-branded titles. I am anxious. I am depressed, blah, blah, blah. And they become like these coat hangers of excuses. In other words, I can't do that because I am. I can't do that because I have. And so they really take us down a pathway of perpetual lowering of the bar of expectation and excellence in life.
You're right. I think as individuals, we've lowered our personal standards of what quality is, and we don't know what standards we should actually imply in our own life. And as I'm looking at growing my own health, it's kind of funny because, I've talked about anxiety for a while over the past few years, to where some could even label it to, what is it called? Panic disorder, where my heart rate gets so high and it feels like it's beating and everything is like swirling around me. And through this process, instead of accepting, oh, I have anxiety now, oh, I have panic disorder now, I've just realized, like, okay, how is this a gift? Is my question. How is this a gift? One, not only do I sympathize with people and understand people and what they're going through, but the other part of it is, if it didn't used to be like this, what changed?
That's it.
And I can honestly say I'm probably living healthier now than I've ever lived, still struggling with it. But I've also known that my body's gotten older and it's changed. And so through this process, I look at that as the effect, not the cause. And I feel like a lot of people look at anxiety as a cause.
Bingo.
This is the effect of something else. And so as I've been on this journey, going back to vitamins and supplements, I remember a few years ago when you started putting me on kind of like this regimen of vitamins, and it's helped drastically, and my issue is I need to be consistent, because I can miss 2 or 3 days because I forget, or I didn't refill, or whatever it is. And so the vitamins that you put me on are magnesium, zinc, D with K2, C, B, and I think that's it. I've also been looking at rhodiola. I just got GABA, and then also we talked about ashwagandha the other day. Would you go through that list and kind of share like why these are important for us to add them into our life and the effects of what they do?
Yeah, sure. And that we also need to make sure we have omega-3 fatty acids, not just fish oil. I've tested thousands of people over the last 10 years, and 100% have been deficient. That's some pretty good odds. It's because we just don't get that in our diet. We get too many omega-6s, which create inflammation. You can go back to systemic inflammation, or let's call it even brain inflammation. So you need a quality omega-3 fatty acid that's going to have 3 parts to 2 parts approximately of EPA over DHA, and you need about 3 grams. Most people are super cheap with omega-3s, and they go buy something at your local Costco, and it's absolute junk. It doesn't work. It's not the right form, and it's actually creates more inflammation. So you need that. Vitamin D is incredibly important for brain health. When vitamin D goes low, we end up getting depressed or blue or slow, moody-wise, right? That's why even in the wintertime, without sunshine, which actually helps with, since it's not vitamin D, we find ourselves in this seasonal affective disorder known as SAD. So usually when the sun goes forward, we go forward in this thing we call daylight savings time, giving us more daylight in the day. Conceivably, when the days get longer, we get less depressed. You look at vitamin B, magnesium, those help form neurotransmitters. Amino acids, which come from proteins, help form neurotransmitters. Cleaning up the diet, of course, helps nutrients get absorbed from the food, which helps form neurotransmitters. The assimilation of the nutrients we take is improved with good diet. Even with good diet, we don't get enough nutrients in there, most likely, right? So that's why supplementation becomes not just a good idea, but it becomes really somewhat critical, I believe. So when you look at it like that from that point, we have to have these things. When you look at these adaptogenic herbs, like rhodiola, ashwagandha, etc., the term adaptogenic means they don't stimulate and they don't draw down. They create adaptation and they create balance. Now, again, it's not as simple as saying that we take a pill for an ill. That's not the concept we want. We want to think adding something to a diet to supplement a diet, not supplant a diet. Today in the supplement world, people want to take a pill and not change the diet. It's the same process as big pharma, isn't it? It's the same deal, right? It might be a little more safe, maybe a little more healthy, but it's still a waste of time because we're not getting any better. And supplement industry is $152 billion and growing. Go figure. I believe you also mentioned GABA. GABA, I mentioned serotonin and dopamine are stimulatory or excitatory. GABA is inhibitory, meaning it draws one down. So when you take GABA, it's been shown to increase focus. So if you get too much dopamine going on, you can be all jittery and hyper, and almost over anxious. Too much serotonin will do that to you too. But GABA tends to bring it down quickly, bringing more calm to the situation. And it can create overall peace to the body. And that's why it's been shown to be something that students have performed better in test taking skills if they'd taken GABA, before they took the test, because it sort of would ease this idea of test anxiety.
That's awesome. So moving forward, I'm an individual who's just learning this for the first time. What is step one?
Step one is if you have been, diagnosed with something like that, don't own it. Realize you may be exhibiting those symptoms. That may be true, but the symptoms are not the cause. As you said earlier, we must go back and really seek out and search out the cause. The cause is really not getting the presence and or assimilation of good nutrients to form the neurotransmitters we need to function properly within our neurochemistry. So the first thing to do is start with one meal a day, and make sure that we eat good food. For me, and this is what I'd say to anybody, you want to start with maybe a shake or something like that, maybe a full meal shake. I like what we developed called Kingdom Fuel because I feel like that meets the bill because it has vitamins, minerals, 20 grams of organic pea protein. It has soluble and insoluble fiber and greens and reds, so you're going to get your phytonutrients. You got to get one meal in a day that's going to be beneficial, that has no negligible ingredients and has what you need. Start right there. Number two, and this is a close second, but not to be minimized by number one, you got to get some activity. It has been proven time and time again that exercise metabolizes adrenaline, which is a precursor to cortisol. And we know when you get stressed, the body produces cortisol by design to keep you alive. Cortisol is not bad, but if you're hyper stressed in our world, it can be a bad thing, and it can cause belly fat gain. It can cause maldigestion. If you're living chronically stressed, you're not going to absorb food anyway. You're not supposed to, because the body is interpreting your stress as being chased by a lion. So it's like we got to get past this idea. So we've got to change our life. So number 2 was movement. And I recommend walking every day. It's like that's what our legs are made to do. They're not made to just hang over a chair or sit cross-legged in a chair. They're made to ambulate, to walk. Number 3, right behind this, you got to get some sleep. Today, people are so wired up and they get into this computer, cell phone, TV stuff late at night. And interestingly enough, that blue light coming from the screens, right? It emits at 3,500 or 5,500 Kelvin temperature. Now, compare that to the temperature of the noonday sun, 3,500. What does that do to us? It creates cortisol. Cortisol produced at the time we should be producing melatonin to relax. So it inhibits sleep patterns, causing weight gain, causing more stress, and the beat goes on. So we talked about food, exercise, and sleep. And when you manage those things well, you really capitalize on the 4th thing we need to do, which is manage this idea of stress. Stress has been inappropriately deemed a noun. That is not true. Stress is a verb, as evidenced by this definition. It's an action or decision we make in regard to life's expected or unexpected occurrences. So if that's true, that makes us have control over stress and not becoming controlled by stress. You can't be controlled by a verb.
Right.
A verb is something you do. So it's an action you take. So we've got to like redefine that. So, but those 4 things right there, Evan, we've got to make a daily intentional effort. And I mean effort, because you got to think about it, to put effort into those areas to master those. Because if you don't, you're going to resort back. And the older you get, this is true. I'm telling you right now, the world gets smaller. Your habits get more ingrained and inbrained, and you won't change.
Yeah, it's harder to create neural pathways.
Hard to change an old dog a new trick, whatever. It's the same deal. Older people, man, they won't move. They get in their little house, they won't move, they won't get out because it makes them uncomfortable. We need to begin to embrace the uncomfortableness and overcome it.
Yeah, that's something that over the past few years, I interviewed a Navy SEAL, Tom Shea, and so many people are fearful of being uncomfortable. And I realized that's so true. He talked about, just 50 years ago, probably more than 50 years actually at this point, but say in the early 1930s, there wasn't indoor plumbing at most places. So in the middle of the night and dead of winter, if you needed to take a crap, you had to bear the cold weather. It took grit. And we've lost this grittiness over time because we have gained so much comfort. And so if we're not putting ourselves in a position to be uncomfortable, then we're actually creating more weakness within inside of us. And going back to the 4 things that you talked about, something that I want to add to that is then make it measurable. Because if you don't measure it and track it, you won't do it. And this is something that I've started learning in my own life. Like the very first thing I really started measuring and tracking, Mark, is my sleep. And once I started getting better sleep, I noticed a difference in my life. But there was an issue. I was sleeping 9 to 10 hours a day. Not because I wanted to, but because that's what my body was telling me it needed. And so I let it. And so I started monitoring my sleep, but then I realized, so I bought this ring, which is a sleep monitor. And what it does is it lets me know how much I'm waking up at the night, how restful my sleep is. And turns out my sleep wasn't very restful. Oh, and by the way, my oxygen levels were dropping significantly throughout the night. Well, you know what that told me? I might have sleep apnea.
That's right.
And so what I ended up doing is I went and took a sleep study test. Guess what? I have sleep apnea. And I've had it not since I gained my weight, but I've had it for a very long time because I remember waking up, even when I was thin, not breathing. And so now that I'm on a CPAP, I'm sleeping 7 to 7.5 hours consistently. Like that's what. So I've lowered my sleep, but now I'm getting more significant, better sleep, which then in return helps me show up. And then there's lots of apps to track your food. There's apps to track your sleep. There's apps to track your physical output. And I'll tell you, the thing that one of the things I'm really proud about in my life is last year I did a triathlon. And the reason why thank you. The reason why I did it is because I thought I couldn't. And so ever since then, I've started doing things that I thought I couldn't do. So since that triathlon, I've done 3 5Ks. And on 3 of those, on all 3 of those, my son joined me. He's 7. He can run a 10-minute mile.
That's cool.
And it started with breaking the cycle in my life. And when I did the triathlon and I came home and I laid down because my heart rate and adrenaline was through the roof. And then I didn't understand how long it would take for the adrenaline to come down because I just put my body through the most intense workout I've ever done. It took a while. I thought I was having a panic attack, to be honest. But my son comes in to the bedroom as I'm laying down and he goes, "Dad, I am so proud of you." And I go, "Oh, thank you so much. Why are you proud of me?" He goes, "Because you did something you thought you couldn't do."
Wow. That's
He
big.
got it. And so everything that you're talking about, transitioning this to fatherhood and motherhood, like what we do sets the tone generationally. And I look at my parents and I look at my in-laws, and I'll tell you, I remember we lived with my in-laws for 6 months. And there was, make a long story short, we rented our house out. We moved out of state. That job didn't work out. We moved back. And then instead of buying or renting an apartment, we just moved in with my in-laws for 6 months till we could get our house back. But just due to their lack of ability to move, they just didn't do a lot of cleaning in their kitchen. And it, like my wife and I really couldn't cook or do anything. And so what we did for those 6 months is we ended up just eating out all of our meals. You talk about a killer of a bad habit that created over 6 months to now in my life. Like we're 11 years later. And that's still a very bad habit that got created over 6 months. And so what I realized, like generationally as a parent, I have a responsibility to install good habits into my kids. And I can tell you, Mark, I feel like I'm failing because every day after school, my kids are like, "Hey, let's go get a treat. Let's go get a snack." And they ask because there's a certain level of expectation that they know that they'll get it. And I don't do it every day, but I noticed 2 or 3 maybe times a week, I end up doing it. And it became, okay, now I'm just going to do it because I don't want the nagging. And so as a parent, how do I make the change in my own life, but bring my family with me? Because that's hard. Because then if I don't have their support, it makes me not want to do it because I see them eating junk and they're bringing it into the house. How do I change as a parent and then change the dynamics of my family?
There's a higher cause and a higher purpose. God made man first for a reason, to fellowship with him. Jesus was a nonconformist. He did what he did, went all the way to the cross, despite everybody else doing something else. We know the story. As men, we ought to represent the epitome of that, having the courage to go forward even when nobody else does. We should not live our lives, Evan, with the intent to be liked or to be honored or to be appreciated or even to be revered, even by our family. Our job really is to represent a godly example of what leadership's about, which is self-sacrifice, which is provision, which is love, even when others hate, which is dealing with the griping and the moaning and complaining, even though you don't want to. Being a dad and being a parent is loving people enough to learn to say no. And one example in the Bible that I'll give you again, Adam and Eve. What would have happened if Adam would have had the courage to grab the apple out of Eve's hand and say, "Let's get out of here, quit talking to that devil"? You know, he didn't. And that today, Evan, is the epitome of what mankind's failures have been. Men have not stepped up. They stepped back. You go back to the 70s with the women's rights movement. Now, women have been treated badly. I will acknowledge that by our country, not being able to vote, treated as second-class citizens, unacceptable, inexcusable. Nothing should be said about that. We should never go back there. Even we can, look at that with the slavery issue. Horrible abomination, right?
Right.
But if men would have been men at that time, maybe women wouldn't have had to step up and be in the roles that they had to embrace. And today, sadly, in our practice in our lives, I see this all the time. Women generally lead the way in health. Women generally lead the way spiritually. Isn't that fascinating? Why is that? Because men have become, quite frankly, as we were talking about before we came on here live, men are becoming soy boys. And I'm saying that to get a shock value and attention because it really is. Why are men putting on so much weight? Why are they getting lower testosterone? Why are they working less hard? Why are they not having the courage and the strength, physically, emotionally, spiritually, to go forward?
Yeah.
Because they became very passive. And we are not designed as men to be passive. We're to actively pursue excellence with the desire to please and honor God in every part of our lives. And nobody, Evan, said that's going to be easy, because I can tell you it's not. Will we fail? Yeah. Do we plan on failing? No. We never set our bar so low. Well, I'm going to fail a few times this week and it's okay. It's not okay.
Yeah.
Because it sets the tone. Just like you used an example of your children, looking for a treat. You set the tone, and the more that tone is set, the more that tone is ingrained and embrained.
So
and the longer that's like that. Yeah.
How do we set the tone, but also have grace on ourselves? Because here's my struggle with this is I will set myself up to try to be perfect and I fail. And then therefore I want to give up. And when I go into that, how do we shift from, okay, strive for high excellence, but when you don't achieve it, have grace on yourself? Like, what's that like?
It looks like this. When you get up, you plan on achieving the goals and living the excellent life that you set out to do, the intentionality. Do not even think about failing. It's not an option as you start off. But if you make a bonehead decision and fall down, you get your, back up. You don't cry about it. You move forward. Because we're in a war, man. I mean, think about this as a battle, right? I mean, picture the battle, the analogy, and you've got your enemy out front of you, and they're coming at you to take you out. And you have your weaponry, whatever this looks like, to take them out. And you're on the offensive, using your excellence. And let's say, for whatever reason, you don't pay attention one moment, and you get hit by a blow, an enemy bullet, whatever the case may be. Are you going to decide to just lay there and quit? Or are you going to get back up and fight back even harder? We must choose to fight back even harder. It is not about, looking back at the failures and putting, focus on them. Grace is being able to understand mankind's worst, including our own, and knowing that we need God's help to keep us going forward. It's like, but don't dwell on it. In other words, the longer one lives in life, and I've been on this planet now, shocks me to say almost 6 decades, crazy. And I have made some bonehead, goofy, dumb, irresponsible, ungodly decisions. And they cost you. They do. And yet, if I dwell on those, that keeps me being controlled by those.
Yeah.
But if I realize that if I can't forgive myself as a man, as God forgives me, how can I forgive anybody else? How can I execute that grace on anybody else? So it becomes this idea of learning to give oneself grace so that grace can manifest through you in your life towards other people.
That's good. Now, as we're wrapping up, someone might be thinking, why should I listen to this guy? One of my favorite things about you, Mark, when we first met, it was 2 years ago, it was right around the beginning of the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
And something that I've learned is that our poor health creates inflammation in our body. And regardless of what experts say, from my understanding, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but what we faced in the pandemic, because I can't say the other word or else they'll take it down from other platforms. It wasn't respiratory. It was actually in the blood. And what I've noticed is when we have inflammation in the blood, it affects all other areas. Now, there are many doctors who tried to treat many people and had their patients die. How many people did you treat with this lifestyle change and vitamins? And what was your life to death percentage?
Wow. I get asked that a few times, believe it or not. We're probably about 11,000 plus right now. Frankly, I stopped counting because I stopped thinking about it, and nobody's died, which is, I get a little bit emotional when I think about that because, I realize people's struggles in life, and I realize the misleading information they've gotten to be controlled by fear, and how Big Pharma has controlled guidance and principles today, and it's become profit over people. Systems of health are not systems of health. They're systems of sickness that profit from sickness. And so we've got to understand that that's not the system we need to operate on as people.
Right.
And it's been a battle, man. It's been a war. And frankly, I didn't think and still don't think it's anything special we're doing other than doing the right things that make sense. And I think people listening right now would say, well, that makes sense. Why aren't my doctors saying this? Well, because they still want to have a job. Right. That's just it. You cannot do that. That's not the way it works. And I've said this statement before, and I'll say it again, just prove the point. If a person is going to their doctor, a person that is claiming to be a doctor, whatever the case may be, and that person is not talking to them at all about the things we talked about, lifestyle, sleep, nutrition, exercise, rest, de-stressing. If they're not talking about that and they're just giving a pill, they did not see a doctor. They saw a government-funded drug dealer. That's what they saw. And that's where we are right now. And we have got to operate under a different system, knowing full well we need drugs at times if we have an emergency. That's great. But that system we have, Evan, is not about getting people well. Yeah. And inflammation, as you noted, was chronic and systemic. And we had a platform in people's lives. America was chronically, systemically inflamed already before the pandemic. And we have been for years. And it's not changed, sadly. It's getting worse because no one wants to deal with what stuff we're talking about. They want a pill for an ill, a drug for this, a drug for that, and it's not going to work. It will prove to be our demise.
Absolutely. And as we're wrapping up, for people who think that this pandemic was a one-time thing, did you know they're already planning for another pandemic in 2025 that they're already creating vaccines for? Like, I forgot the name of what they're calling it, but they're already running drills and tests for a pandemic in 2025. I think it's SERS, SERS, or something like that.
Yeah, I think you're right. The people should know that these viruses, these gain of function research experimentations are done under the cover of knowing what to do in a biological warfare situation.
Right.
However, in any sort of information, there's always an evil usage of it and then a healthy, beneficial usage of it. And so you see the evil usage of it. We have 66 vaccines now approved and in use by the CDC. We have 4 for COVID right now approved and used by the CDC. Do we and are we born with a vaccine or medication deficiency?
Nope.
I don't think so. So
So
we've got to sort of wake up.
there's this book called The Physics of God. It's not a Christian book. It was written in, I think, like 2016. And it talked about the Human Genome Project in 2012, where they studied proteins and other aspects of the body of how it would basically create what was needed to fight off diseases. And so
that's right.
They learned when they introduced proteins to the body didn't need it, even though it didn't have all the needs that it technically, supposedly they thought it did. But what they learned is that the body could create what it needed to survive.
Yep.
And in this process, they discovered spiked proteins and manipulating DNA. And then here's what was really crazy in this book, Mark. There's this thing that they called the life force in the DNA that they couldn't see past. But out of it flowed all of life and all transformation. And as a spiritual person, it's like, that's the soul. That's the spirit that God put in men, because when they looked at a dead body, it wasn't there. When they looked at a living person, it was there. And when they looked at people who had multiple personalities, and they studied people with multiple personalities, the DNA changed from this so-called life source that also included physical differences of manifestations on people's body. As a spiritual person, I'm like, that's demon possession. And so I say all that to say, we need to be so alert in this time, because as it's getting closer for the return of Jesus, the world is becoming further and further corrupt. And we need to learn how to live and be healthy on our own accord, according to the kingdom of God and his principles, so that when the day comes, we aren't reliant on a system produced by an antichrist. And if you think it's not happening, I mean, just the other day, we had 2 major banks in America fail. You don't think that that's on purpose? That is coming to push a Fed coin, which is all digital currency, which can be programmed and monitored. And then that's the predecessor, what I believe, for a one world currency, which the Bible actually talks about. So all this health stuff that we go through, if we didn't learn this from COVID, if you can have autonomy of your own health, then you aren't reliant on a government system. Because think about it. How many people were fired for not getting a vaccine? How many people were let go from their jobs? Many doctors and nurses who were the heroes then became the villains. And so I'm just saying, what I've learned in my own life is I need to take personal responsibility for my own health and do it in a kingdom principle way. And a lot of that I've learned from you. So I'm grateful for it. Mark, where can people find you?
Yeah. They can go to Sherwood.tv. All of our resources are there, all of our plans, all of our programs. And if people want to work with us, they can. We have a free webinar twice a month. People can attend, and they can schedule appointments from there if they want to. So there's all kinds of ways people can work with us. And you can even get a free ebook if you just want to go there, and you'll see it. But we're just out here to bless people and give them some hope, right? And hope keeps us alive.
Well, Mark, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today. I hope you have a great day, and we'll talk to you soon.
All right, man. God bless you. Thanks for having me.
Take care.